The murder of a British soldier in Woolwich on the 22nd of May has continued to dominate the headlines and flood the airwaves. On this week's Politics and Media, we're going to have a look at the responses by the media, community leaders and the political class to a shocking and unprovoked attack and discuss what the wider implications are for British Muslims. With me now is John Esposito, a Professor of International Affairs and Islamic Studies at Georgetown University and Senior Scientist at the Gallup Centre for Muslim Studies. John, welcome to the programme. Can you just explain to the viewers whether or not this response by the government and the media fits into a pattern that you've been able to identify internationally in response to events like these?
I think that there's a tendency, to begin with, when we talk about the media's response, while one can talk about media providing better coverage at times in dealing with the broader Muslim community in recent years, the media is still naturally, in terms of what they do, they're driven by, as the American phrase goes, if it bleeds, it leads. And too often the stories that are out there are the stories that constantly emphasize, for example, the extremism. There's been a major study done by Media Tenor looking at some 950,000 pieces of media coverage, excuse me, BBC, CNN, and others. And what one sees is that there's still a disproportionate coverage of extremism, and incredibly disproportionate, and the mainstream Muslim community. The fallout from that means that when you get this kind of attack that's taken place, which is, which is barbaric, and should be absolutely condemned and dismissed. For many people in society, they are open to anti-immigrant, right-wing, Islamophobic type rhetoric that in fact brushstrokes the entire Muslim community, and then you see the kind of fallout that occurs. Now, this is where government becomes important. It seems to me that unless government is really careful in making the right distinctions, and in the way that it approaches questions of how it proceeds to go after, for example, what I would call the preachers of hate and some of these groups, but to make that distinction between that and the broader Muslim community when it comes to issues of surveillance, when it comes to issues of government rhetoric, then we'll continue to have the problems that we're having, both for example, in the UK as well as in the US.
John, can I just ask you, are there some places or some institutions that are dealing with this in a better way than others, as far as you're concerned?
Well, I think that there are institutions, but when I think of institutions, they tend to be increasingly both in the US and UK. They're the two that I'm most aware of, although I follow incidents in other countries in Europe. There are institutions that are now creating projects that monitor both government and media responses and also attempt to monitor the right, that is the far right, in terms of their responses. But I don't see the kind of significant government and media constructive response that we need. As I perhaps tried to indicate, in the last 10 years, for example, when you look at media coverage, and there have been some major media reports on this, Media Tenor, which is based in Europe, has covered this, you actually see that while there's been a significant increase in the cover of stories on extremism, there's been absolutely no significant increase in the cover of stories about the various Muslim communities.
Okay, John, I'm going to have to stop you there because we're going to have to return to the discussion in the studio on precisely this issue, because the tabloids are not known for their restraint, and this was no exception. The Express, Mirror and Daily Star all referred to the attack as a beheading, although later it was revealed that this was not the case. Lurid pictures of the main suspect, Michael Adebolajo, holding a machete with blood-stained hands, adorned the front covers of all the main papers. The main amateur video that the pictures were taken from has been another major point of controversy in the media coverage of the attack, both for the violent nature of the content and for the dangers posed by allowing Adebolajo's words to be given a platform.
The government is treating as an Islamist terror attack the hacking to death of a man in a South London street.
A bloody broad daylight murder in London.
I say this is very, very disturbing.
There are strong indications that it is a terrorist incident.
Those carrying out the attack may have cried out Allahu Akbar, God is great, and were of Muslim appearance.
The Home Secretary is chairing Cobra tonight to bring together the police, the security services, all of the agencies, so that we gather every piece of information that we can. I'll be returning to London later tonight so that I can chair a Cobra meeting again in the morning. This was not just an attack on Britain and on the British way of life. It was also a betrayal of Islam.
The killing monopolised the media for days and the political class was quick to respond. The Prime Minister assured us that one of the best ways of defeating terrorism is to go about our normal lives. Yet David Cameron returned from Paris and scrambled his Cobra team, usually only reserved for the events of the highest urgency, a move which some have suggested was an overreaction. On the other hand, many praised his appeal for unity and solidarity in the face of terror, as well as his condemnation of attacks as un-Islamic and his praise for British Muslims. I'm joined in the studio by two chief political commentators, Peter Oborne, of the Daily Telegraph, and John Rentoul from The Independent on Sunday. Welcome to the programme, both of you. John, how do you feel about the media reaction here? What were those early stories before there was any real knowledge of what had happened? Were they an overreaction?
Well, no. I mean, I think you've got to distinguish between the immediate reaction and what followed, because, I mean, while things are unclear, while you've heard terrible stories about something very strange happening on the streets of Woolwich, which is just a normal part of London, people are anxious and they're worried and they seek reassurance. So I think it was quite right for David Cameron, for example, to cut short his visit to Paris and to come back, because, you know, while the situation is still unknown, people want politicians to be doing everything they can to find out what's happened and deal with it appropriately.
Peter, what do you reckon?
I think that the Prime Minister's immediate response was excellent. I think the language he used was faultless. Thereafter, I think they did start to overreact. I agree with the suggestion that Cobra was not really necessary. I think these measures which are now being talked about are also unnecessary. I mean, what happened was a villainous and evil killing on a London street, and that's the end of the matter.
Yeah, I mean, that's the issue, really, isn't it? Because, I mean, all right, I guess in one definition of the word terrorism, this is a politically motivated murder, but it is a single event. There seems to be relatively little to suggest that it's part of some very widespread or continuing conspiracy. And I guess that's where the question of overreaction enters into the discussion.
Well, I think that was clear the next day. But, I mean, as Peter said, I mean, the Prime Minister's response was measured. He didn't, unlike Tony Blair's response to 7/7, for example, he didn't immediately suggest that there would have to be some legislative response. He said that the proper response would be to carry on as if nothing had happened. I mean, obviously, you know, he hadn't carried on as if nothing had happened, but I mean, generally speaking, that was the right tone to strike, and I think he responded extremely well.
And I feel quite a lot of intense sympathy for the Prime Minister. There's an attempt being made in quite a lot of newspapers to make something of the fact he went on holiday a few days later. I feel absolutely sympathetic with the Prime Minister. That was the right thing to do, to go on holiday to Spain, wherever he went on holiday to.
And if we separate out the media response from the government response, how do you feel that the media dealt with this?
I think there is a sort of, and it's not the first time we've seen it. We saw it in Boston, and actually we're seeing it repetitiously now. A sort of pornography of violence. If you look at what happened in Boston, I think on Sky TV, I reckon it probably about 1,000 times that explosion was shown in the 24 hours. I may be wrong, but it seems to be every 2 minutes. And here, there's very good video footage. I can see this, and it's good TV. But I think there is a danger of everything concentrates on this one spot, and a sort of lack of proportion. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible event, but a lack of proportion. I mean, I can't help thinking, by the way, that we know that drone strikes in Afghanistan take out a village and may kill a family or lots of children and so on. But because nobody can film it and get there, but it is utterly devastating for that community, and it's not always just sort of murderer killers who get, whole communities get taken out, and there is a sort of self-referential aspect to this, to these stories.
But I mean, that's the nature of media. I mean, we are interested in the extremes. I mean, as our Georgetown professor said, I mean, the media covers the extremes of human behaviour because that's what people are interested in, and they're particularly interested in what happens on streets like theirs. I mean, the reason the British media is so excited about this and so obsessed with it is because it happened on an ordinary London street. It could have happened to any of us.
That many people made, at least in the social media, between this event and the killing of a Muslim pensioner in Birmingham only a few weeks before, where he's stabbed from the back repeatedly, so that the blade comes through his chest. I mean, this is if it bleeds, it leads. It should be. Perhaps this is it is at least a politically motivated attack, as far as the West Midlands police can tell. But there's a disproportionate response in media.
But there's violence in society all the time, and people are interested in violent crime, and that crime probably would have had more attention if it hadn't been for this crime, which was.
Hang on, it was several weeks before the killing of the Muslim pensioner took place. Several weeks before. I mean, and I agree with what you're leading to in that question, is that it seems to have been an Islamophobic attack, although and there's certainly not a lot of curiosity in the media to find out whether or not it was an Islamophobic attack, and I think that it was virtually ignored. I mean, but for a long,
The Guardian,
time.
to its credit, ran a story.
And absolutely, I agree with you that the episodes like these, which are very, very shameful and worrying on British streets, are not given anything like the proper prominence.
Well, that's because people are concerned about terrorism, aren't they? Because, I mean, the suggestion is that what happened in Woolwich was part of, political Islamist ideology, which is aimed at the instruments of the British state and the British Army in particular. And so that is of concern, because that kind of ideology could lead to wider terrorist attacks, which could affect anybody.
Okay, well, let's leave that question because we've got to move on. Muslim leaders jumped to condemn the attack and draw a line between the attackers and the Muslim community as a whole. Within a few hours of the killing, the Muslim Council of Britain expressed their outrage and condemned the killing.
This is a truly barbaric act that has no basis in Islam, and we condemn this unreservedly. We urge Muslim communities to reach out to fellow Britons and testify the true reality of our faith.
We do not, and we will never support such evil acts, and strongly suggest that both of these men should be severely punished as criminals and not as so-called Muslims.
This is clearly misrepresentation of Islam, if any. We condemn to the strongest terms possible, and we are very sorry.
Well, some Muslim commentators were concerned at the over-eagerness of other Muslim leaders to apologise for the attack that they don't feel that Muslims are responsible for. Do you think that's a reasonable criticism of some of the responses, John, or not?
No, I think it's very important for representatives of the Muslim faith to say that this is obviously nothing to do with their faith and their interpretation of it. The idea that, I mean, clearly, what happened in Woolwich bears no relation to mainstream Muslim thinking. I mean, just as the Red Brigades bore no relation to mainstream Marxist thinking. I mean, you wouldn't expect a Marxist professor to have to come out and condemn those acts in the 1970s. But given the intimate link between some kind of Islamist ideologies and the religion, I think it's absolutely reasonable and right and for representatives of that religion to disown it.
I guess it's a question of emphasis, because I think many people do make the point, I mean, that John made in regards to the relationship or not between the Red Brigades and Marxists. Many people say, if somebody who's a Christian does, or the Ku Klux Klan do this in the States. Nobody expects the mainstream Christian churches to be hauled out and to be especially accountable. Or
yes, by the way, you suggest they weren't apologising for this. They're very eloquent and distinguished. They were condemning it. And I like to think they're condemning it in the same way that anybody else. The Prime Minister condemned it. We condemned it as newspaper writers. I don't think that the Muslim community, as a generality, has to apologise or condemn it because they're Muslims. This is, as the Prime Minister said, and as the Imam was saying, it was an un-Islamic act.
But I do think it's very important that imams should come out and say that
point, yeah.
Because if they don't, then the worst interpretations of Islam will be allowed to spread.
Yeah, on the other, I'm interested to see if you agree with me about this. Yesterday, in the Mail on Sunday, the former Prime Minister, Tony Blair, came and said it was an Islamic act, very specifically, contradicting David Cameron and saying that this act sort of came out of Islam and there was a violence within Islam. I thought it was a terrible article, which really fueled it almost could have come from the EDL, which the former Prime Minister, I mean, you understand Tony Blair's mental makeup more than anybody else. What was going on there?
Take up that onerous burden,
I thought
John.
he actually expressed himself rather more moderately than that. I think he said what he has said a million times before, what other people have said, which is that this is a perversion of Islam. There is an ideology behind it. And we shouldn't just write off what happened at Woolwich as the actions of slightly deranged sociopaths. I don't actually agree with him about that, actually, because I think just as Timothy McVeigh was motivated by some kind of ideological anti-Americanism, I mean, I think he still was essentially a lone operator, a slightly deranged individual. And I think, without going into too much detail about Woolwich, I think that's probably what happened there.
But the other thing I thought was, I thought it was a wretched article by Tony Blair.
Well, you think any article
no,
by Tony
that's
Blair
not fair,
writes
actually.
is
It's not
probably
no,
fairly
we're just going, because a wretched sentiment then, because all religions have within them violence.
Well, no, I think
and to say he said there's something about Islam which I thought was a terrible thing to say.
He didn't say that, actually. He said that there is a strain within Islam. There is a perversion of Islam.
But he also said other religions don't have that strain. That he was, and that was what was very.
That is a factual statement.
It's not about Christianity. Christianity has that strain. And I'm a Christian. I read the Bible. Try reading the Bible.
But where are there groups of Christians who are motivated by what they regard as a version of the Christian faith to conduct acts of violence?
I will give you an example of that.
We might want to formulate that a little bit differently and say that at different points in history, and not necessarily that this potential is exhausted, certain religions have. I mean, this country's civil war killed more people than any other war, including the First World War, and it was fought precisely by Christians on both sides.
It shows an incredible lack of knowledge of history, and it's deeply offensive to large parts of the rest of the world. Christianity has been responsible for... Yeah, but because there is this strain of Christianity. I was in, 2 years ago, talking about now, a couple of years ago, I was in Jos in Nigeria. There was a slaughter in a village, 200 Muslim villagers were killed. I went to that village shortly afterwards. Every mosque had been burnt down.
That's very different.
And then I went to the church. I then went to the church. I thought, well, I'll go to church this Sunday. And I went to the church. I was interested to see what would be going on. And I listened to a pastor basically reading out some Christian equivalent to the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. And it was, and you understood that Christianity there was being used for purposes of ethnic cleansing. And that is why I found it very difficult of Muslims. Or Mindanao, you can see what's going on there. And so to say that there's something which is specifically, but it was an outrageous thing to say. All religions have this potential to be perverted. Look what Buddhists are doing in Burma against Muslims there. And so it doesn't. All religions have this potential to be perverted by evil people. I don't think, and it is not something. All religions also have, including as the potential to do enormous, wonderful things and force for good.
We're going to have to move us on because there's a huge number of issues that we have to cover. One of them is this, that concerns were raised by the repeated appearance of the self-styled radical preacher Anjem Choudary so soon after the attack. Choudary is a man who was described by the Fox News anchor Sean Hannity as one sick, miserable, evil SOB. And last week, Baroness Worsey described him as a nutter. He also is claimed to remember that Michael Adebolajo from their time together in the now banned group Al Majroon. So was his appearance on Newsnight and Channel 4 something that was bound to provoke outrage from many quarters? The BBC were accused of sensationalising the event by bringing on a so-called hate preacher to express his views. Muslim politician Sadiq Khan and Baroness Worsey condemned them for giving a platform to someone whose views are seen by most Muslims as extreme, unpleasant and violent. So, John, what do you make of this incident? Did the BBC do the right thing here? And what about his treatment when he was on the programme?
Well, I don't think the BBC did the right thing. I think they shouldn't have had him on, but I completely defend their right to put him on. I mean, I think freedom of speech should allow broadcasters, including the public service broadcaster, to interview whomever they want. I disagree with their decision. I don't like Anjem Choudary, and obviously don't think he represents anything meaningful. And in the context of Woolwich, although he claimed to have known some of the alleged perpetrators, I mean, I don't think he represented anything useful, because I don't regard them as typical terrorists or expressions of the kind of perversion of Islam that we were talking about.
So I mean, John's point should be clear that this was kind of so almost off topic that it wasn't a useful part of or meaningful part of a serious discussion.
I rather agree with John. I mean, I think we have to defend the right of the BBC, etc., to have him on, and I do think there is a criticism of the media in general that, when these events take place, they pick out absolute fringe figures. I mean, Anjem Choudary represents nobody, with a tiny, tiny number of them, and bring him on, and that does give a rather sort of very perverse view of what Islam is about. And I think that in that sense, the broadcasters are open to criticism, but I absolutely defend their right to
I think the media, obviously are interested in extremes, and they're interested in extreme expressions of some political Islamist views. But I don't think that's an excuse. I mean, I think responsible media should ignore him.
There was one extraordinary moment during the interview, though, wasn't there, where whatever you think about his views, however objectionable you found them, Kirsty Walk said to him, well, if you don't like it, why don't you go back to your own country? And he said, well, actually, I was born here. I mean, coming from a woman who's one referendum away from having to go back to her own country anyway, I mean, the bizarre kind of slippage into a rather unpleasant language in that way.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you are going to have Anjem Choudary on, then the best way to embarrass him and to expose him for what he is to treat him extremely politely.
Yeah. Do you find that an extraordinary moment in the interview? I mean, it was a kind of,
I didn't see
it was
it
kind
actually,
of sit-up moment, I thought, in the...
But I almost for the first time in my life, found myself agreeing with Mr. Rentoul here. I think that you should treat him with proper politeness, but also forensically, of course.
OK, well, thank you both. We're coming up to the break now, but do stay tuned for part 2. We'll be examining the political response to the attack.